The tube map, as designed by Harry Beck, is a marvel of design that reduces an increasingly complex transport network down to a simple, easy-to-understand form. I'll admit that it's not perfect, and many people have tried to improve on it, but there's no denying that in its basic form, it's a classic. One of the most important features is the colour scheme. Each line has an easy-to-differentiate colour that can be followed by eye. But here's a question. How did they come to choose the different colours? Well, I did some digging, and while I'll admit that there's a certain amount of conjecture and he said, she said, I think I can have a reasonable stab at explaining it. Or most of it. Or at least I have some interesting stories. And in the end, isn't that better than precise historical records? Before we begin, let's take a look at this map from 1908, which is generally considered to be the first tube map. There had been earlier maps, but this one, published by Underground Electric Railways of London, was the first to cover all the tube lines and only those. Underground Electric Railways, or UERL, owned the District, Piccadilly, Bakerloo and Hampstead lines at the time. The map was part of a programme of cooperation with other tube lines to make the system more user-friendly. The only existing tube line not on there is the Waterloo and City. They were owned by a main line company, the London and South Western Railway. The lines are colour-coded, but not all the lines have the same colours that we know today. As the network expanded, the maps became more complicated. In the early 1930s, draftsman Harry Beck came up with a simplified representation of the Underground, which really is more like a diagram than a map. On its publication in 1933, the radical new map was a hit. As well as simplifying the network, it featured a bold colour scheme which has, mostly, remained the same to the present day. The Metropolitan Line, on the present map, is dark red, although it's varied in purpleness over the decades. Dark red was the colour the Metropolitan Railway used on their locomotives from 1885 onwards. I've heard the colour described by some as purple and some as brown. I've always thought of it as maroon. But the official line was that it was dark red, specifically a colour known as mid-cared, a word I have never seen used outside of the context of the Metropolitan Railway, and never heard spoken out loud. I may be mispronouncing it. If you know the correct pronunciation and you are alive, let me know in the comments section. The Metropolitan Railway became part of the Underground in 1933, the same year the Beck tube map was published, but locomotives would continue to be painted maroon until, well, technically at least one of the preserved locomotives was never withdrawn, so until the present day, I guess. So anyway, that's why the Metropolitan Line is mid-cared. Mid-card? I don't know. The District Railway initially borrowed locomotives from the Metropolitan Railway, but following a dispute over the Circle Line tracks they shared, the District decided to buy their own locomotives in 1871. These were green. Interestingly, before 1885, the Metropolitan engines were painted olive green, and I wonder if they changed to red to differentiate themselves from their rivals. I have heard it suggested that the district's colour is derived from the various greens and parks along the line. And while that's a cute idea, I've not seen any official confirmation that that's where it comes from. I'm going with the district railway theory. Whichever explanation you go with, the district has been green since the first UERL maps. Actually, for a brief period, from 1937 to 1948, the Metropolitan Line was also green, which I would imagine was quite confusing. The Northern Line has been black on the map since the very start. Or at least the City and South London Railway has, and that became part of the Northern Line. The most common suggestion I've heard for this is that it represents the darkness of the first deep-level tube. I am not so sure about that. In 1908, it would have been one of 7 deep-level tube lines on the map, and I doubt the publicity-conscious Underground would have wanted to emphasise that a different company came up with the idea first. Another suggestion is that as the line ran up the middle of the map, it would have made sense from an orientation point of view to give it a colour that stood out. Certainly I think that might explain why the colour was retained even after 1933. The central line is red, although it used to be orange. When Harry Beck came to assemble his map, he originally kept it orange, but decided for the second edition that red was a better choice, because the Central Line was a strong east-to-west presence running right across the middle. Therefore, it made sense to have it in a bold primary colour. Red is also used for the cable car, but no one cares. The Bakerloo Line had been brown or possibly maroon on the very first maps, but by the 1930s it was red. Beck wanted red for the Central Line, but someone, it's not clear whether it was him or management, decided that orange was too easy to confuse with red. Therefore, rather than a straight colour swap from red to orange, the Bakerloo Line went brown. Blue was, at least sometimes, used by UERL to represent the Piccadilly Tube, and Beck decided to stick with that for his map. However, a dark shade was chosen. As with the Bakerloo, this was to avoid confusion. It was feared that a mid-blue could be too easily mixed up with the green of the District Line, especially given that they shared a lot of their routes. It should be noted that often the reason a colour is settled on is simply because it's easy to distinguish from the others. That's why, when the Circle Line first appeared as a separate colour in 1949, it was yellow, outlined with black for clarity. The next new line on the map was the Victoria Line in 1968, and there's an interesting story behind this. At the time, London Transport employed a designer named Misha Black. Black was pretty hot stuff. He had been on the design team for the Festival of Britain, and he designed that orange and black tube maquette that's so popular these days. He also worked for British Railways, styling some of their diesel and electric locomotives. In the 50s and 60s there was this perception that blue was a futuristic colour, and I suppose in some ways it was, certainly considering that most locomotives at the time were black or dark green. A prestigious luxury train known as the Midland Pullman was painted blue. The story goes that Misha Black was inspired by this when he was commissioned to work on the Victoria Line. The shade used on the Midland Pullmans, or possibly Pullmen, was known as Nanking Blue, but Black seems to have taken it up a few shades. I kind of wish I'd done an entire video about this, so I could call it Black and Blue. In 1979, the Jubilee Line opened. This had been called the Fleet Line in its development stages. Grey had been chosen as a sort of pun. You know, fleet, navy, battleship grey. You get your chuckles where you can in the world of cartography. Anyway, as an exercise in patriotism, the line was renamed for the 1977 Silver Jubilee, the grey was taken up a couple of shades, and everyone pretends it's now silver. The Hammersmith and City Line and the East London Line had both been considered part of the Metropolitan Line until 1990, when they were marked separately on the map. The pink of the Hammersmith and City and the orange of the East London Line were both chosen simply because they stood out. The Northern City Line had been orange on the 1908 map, but it was now owned by British Rail. When the East London Line became part of the Overground in 2007, orange would be used for the Overground, but a slightly darker shade. And yes, I know I mentioned that Beck rejected orange previously. I think we can put this down to improvements in paper stock, printing technology, and station lighting. Until 1994, the Waterloo and City Line was depicted on the tube map in white. So too was the North London Line, sometimes. These were both kind of honorary tube lines owned by British Rail, but still a very important supplement to the Underground, and something it was very useful for tube passengers to know about. You know, like the cable car wishes it was. In 1994, the Waterloo and City Line officially became part of the tube and took a sort of aqua colour. This is another visual pun of sorts. The Waterloo and City has long held the nickname of the Drain, so it gets a watery colour. So, there you go, the complicated and heavily conjectural history of the colours on the tube map. As far as I'm aware, there's no definitive history on how the map's colours were chosen, but I hope this video is at least a little bit enlightening. Or entertaining. Or filled in the time while you were waiting for the kettle to boil. Well, I hope you enjoyed this colourful tale from the tube. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Thanks as always to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the black outline to my inner circle. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.